So we don't have a quorum, which means that we can't approve the agenda or approve the minutes.
You don't actually need a quorum for the agenda.
No, but we can do the information items. So let's go ahead and get started. This is the July 20th, 2023 meeting of the Land Use Advisory Committee. And thank you to those of you who showed up today.
Yes, thank you. It's good to see you again. It's been a while, for me at least. I'm Raya Esmaeili. I'm planning analyst in local planning assistance, and here to present some information about the minimum density requirements as we have started to explore what those minimum density requirements can potentially be for the 2050 or in the 2050 Regional Development Guide based on the 2050 community designations. Hello. Okay, this is just something that you are very familiar with. We'll be referring to Thrive in the slides, upcoming slides, so I just wanted to put it here for a refresher, and because that was in Thrive is when community designations expanded into 9 total, and the minimum density requirements associated with them increased slightly from the 2030 Regional Development Guide. Sorry, 2030 Regional Development Framework. So this is a part of a process that you are all very familiar with as you were part of this from the start of 2022 until just about 6 months ago. We kicked off the 2050 Community Designations Update Project. We scoped the project. We worked with you in trying to figure out what should be considered in determining different variables and assessments of existing variables for the 2050 community designations. It involved quite a bit of engagement, both internally and externally, and with council members. Went back and forth several times. You might remember all the different iterations of the community designations that you saw. And eventually at the January meeting of LUAC, you made the final recommendation to CDC, and that CDC was that recommendation, was moved to CDC and the Metropolitan Council as the draft proposal for 2050 community designations that will be or is being considered throughout the 2050 regional planning process. It wasn't an official final adoption because that adoption will happen as part of the 2050 Regional Development Guide. As you see that there will be some ongoing refinements potentially as we're working with internally and externally on different policies that could potentially have different implications based on community designation. So that's what the ongoing refinement is about. So this is the proposed 2050 community designations that we talked about and arrived at. The main point to note is that none of the designations outside of the Metropolitan Urban Service Area were changed based on the feedback that we received from both LUAC and our external focus group. The designations within MUSA were slightly changed and became 4 designations instead of 5. So urban, urban edge, suburban, and suburban edge are the ones that we have currently. And the variables mainly changed, one of them changed to the planned residential densities that were based on the 2040 comprehensive plans. Intersection density and age of housing. What was taken out was the percent of developable land. So that was the variables that were considered. Now, what we are going to be talking about today is that in preparing for the discussions on minimum density requirements, what we have started to do is take a look at the minimum densities that were approved as part of the 2030 plans, 2040 plans, and what the communities have been in fact developing at. So and you will see in some of the charts that I'll be showing, you'll see 2030, and that's referring to the cities and, well, mostly cities in this case, because it's only within MUSA that we're looking at right now. As I mentioned, nothing outside of MUSA is changing. That being said, the policies associated with the designations outside of MUSA may in fact change, but the minimum densities that we are mostly concerned with right now are the ones within MUSA. So urban, urban edge, suburban, and suburban edge as proposed by the 2050 designations. So we have taken a look at the 2030 plans and what the community's minimum densities planned minimum densities were, what the community's 2040 minimum planned densities were, and what their actual existing density is. Their actual existing density is basically based on, and that's the entire community, I should say. It does not have a certain time frame, so some of those developed areas may be very old. And also, it only includes areas within MUSA. So if when we were looking at the communities, for example, the cities of Andover, that is half inside and half outside of MUSA, only the half inside of MUSA was considered in the calculation for existing density, because the outside of MUSA is much lower. Understandably, our policies have been different throughout the years, so the pattern of development has been impacted that way as well. That being said, hope that you can see that. So what we did is that taking those numbers from the 2030 plans, 2040 plans, and existing plans, and kind of trying to see where those densities generally fall. This is to do a basic, or at least the basis of a trend analysis of how are communities planning in these different areas, and how are they developing. Again, this is the existing density are the entire community. It does not consider the age of housing specifically. Yes?
Is it only the residential areas and
Yes.
does not include industrial or
That is correct.
commercial? Or?
Yes, the existing housing density was calculated based on areas that were in the 2020 generalized land use process were designated as residential, and then based on the number of households from census and divided by the areas. Paul did all of that calculation. I'm happy to provide the details of it. So then what I did was trying to put that all together to try to make sense of it right next to each other. You will see, and I'm gonna go by community designation and by the 2050, proposed 2050 community designation. So within those, as you're seeing, the areas that are, the numbers that are shown as 2030, for example, those were the communities that in the 2030 process were all, and the 2030 regional development framework were all designated as developed. In the 2040, Thrive MSP 2040, most of these communities that now have the designation of urban, in Thrive were mostly urban center, and one of them was urban. And then you'll see the existing density of these communities. The lowest existing density between these communities is just above 5 units an acre, and the highest is 10. I can tell you the highest is Minneapolis. There are, as you're seeing, for example, in the 2040 plan table, you see that the highest density is 98, but it's not quite showing in the chart. That's an outlier. I try to take the outliers out of the chart so that it doesn't become too small to see. But it is generally showing the distribution of where those minimum densities are in different plans. One noticeable thing that I will tell you between different charts is that you will see from the 2030 to 2040, there's always an increase. That is mostly due to, I would speculate that is mostly due to our minimum density requirements, the Metropolitan Council minimum density requirements changing. So most of these plans, except for those that had identified no growth, most of these plans were consistent with our minimum density requirements. And that means if the 2030 requirement for a plan was 3 units an acre, and in the 2040 it was 5, they did in fact increase from 3 to 5. So you'll see that blue and orange, you'll see that shift between the blue and orange in all of the designations.
And what does the square mean versus those lines?
It's basically just the majority of the distribution of, like that's the highest and the lowest except for the outliers. So the different quartiles and the little X, as you may be able to see, is the median. Yes, I couldn't make it bigger.
Madam
But
Chair,
that just means.
Yes.
I want to let you know, at some point I'll need to take a 10-minute phone call.
Okay,
So when I leave, I'll be back.
okay, thank you. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So going back to this, I'm gonna, we have some discussion questions for you at the end of this presentation. They're not based on community designation, so I'm gonna keep moving forward into the presentation, but at any point, if you have any questions, please stop me and ask me the specific question. But the point of these charts is to see the trend and to see the difference between the planned densities versus the existing densities. I do have the actual numbers with me too. The table was too long, so I didn't put it in here, but if you have specific questions, I can answer that.
When places in the urban and urban edge aren't part of our plat monitoring program, so we wouldn't have data on what actual densities they developed at during, say, 2010 to 2020 and so forth, right?
That's correct, Madam Chair. That being said, the existing density calculation is trying to get at that, but because it has all of the housing at all times, it doesn't account for the last 20 years as plat monitoring is. And even with the ones that are kind of in the suburban areas, not all of them have the activity for all of the 20 years. So the plat monitoring does provide quite a bit of information, but it wasn't necessarily included in here. That being said, in some of these minimum densities for planned densities, plat monitoring did play a role in the planned densities of minimum planned densities of different communities. I do want you to pay attention to the chart on the left, even though it looks like it's, like for example, the existing is very low here, but it is still above 5 versus here that falls below 5. So they're not at the same scale. They do shift quite a bit, but they each are based on designation. So in the urban edge designation of the 2050 designations, in 2030 plans, they were all marked as developed. In 2040 plans, there's a mixture of urban center, urban, and suburban. So they're shifted a little bit.
Can I,
Yes.
Madam Chair, can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
I just want to understand is 2030 the plan suggested density and the existing is what it is today?
Yes, that's correct.
And so is this suggesting that someone screwed up or they didn't actually, they're not abiding by the density required? So that's one part of the question. And then, as I understand it, the whole idea of the density requirement was specifically for the functionality of the sewer and water. Did the functionality of the sewer and water system change between the plan 2030 and 2040?
If I may, Madam Chair. So I'll start with your first question.
Yeah.
And that is actually what you asked somehow shows up in the discussion question that I have at the end as well. But one thing to note is that, first of all, the 2030 planned densities and 2040 planned densities are from the comp plans themselves. So a lot of these plans have had amendments. Even the 2040 plans have had amendments. Those weren't accounted in this calculation. It was just the comp plan itself. But going to your question as to whether, like, what happened between the 2030 and 2040, what we generally see is that in the comp plan is a 20-year planning process. Even though it does include staging, and even though like the affordable housing need number, for example, is associated with one certain decade of those 2 decades, but what tends to happen sometimes is that higher density development, planned higher density development is pushed further into the 2 decades, and then by the time that the time comes, then it's time for update of the 2040 plan. So it's not that anybody screwed up, it just never got realized. So the communities planned for it, but didn't build it that way. It's not against the plan. It's still, anything that they developed is still consistent with their plan. But as we are seeing different amendments or different developments happening, they're happening generally at the lower end of the spectrum of densities that communities have instead of the higher end. Did that answer that question maybe a little bit?
It sort of did. We can go on because I'd be curious as to how my town comes in, because in our estimates we're right where we need to be, the 3 per. And I would just be curious of where you would say that ours is, because I'm wondering how you're measuring it, if it's in our case accurate or not.
Yeah, sure. And one thing I would say as well to your previous question as to the capacity for water and wastewater, that's one of the notions that it has importance in density analysis, is that in our policy, in our minimum density requirements, we do say that your planned residential development needs to be at a certain density. So as you are planning for the future, they have to meet a certain minimum. So that's why during the 2030 and or 2040 or 2050, people won't get penalized for their existing development. It's what you do with the undeveloped land, with the infill and or redevelopment that you have, that is the acreage that we consider in the density calculation. And for future growth, and that's where the future growth will occur, and that's what we would take into account for planning for our services as well, the future growth, not the existing, basically. I hope I answered that question.
Madam Chair, just one clarification.
Sure.
The council also only plans for wastewater services. Water services are not part of the.
Okay, so the the 3 per is wastewater.
The 3 per minimum is to make the dollars work in the wastewater system.
Yeah.
These in the interior parts of the region, more in the core, those minimums are partly a function of transit access, and if you've got transit, you need more density to support the transit, and the price of land drives a higher. Go ahead. Who in the urban edge is the 2.0?
I should have written that down. It may have been one of those communities that, like I said, have had no future growth, but they still had like one development happening that was at a certain density that basically was like, this is okay, this can't, it's not a problem. But I can definitely look at that.
Yeah.
Now.
No, you don't have to do it now. You can do it later.
Okay,
I'm just curious that you would be that urban and be still that low in density.
Yes. Moving forward to the next designation, that's the suburban designation. In the 2030 plans, these designations were both developing and developed communities. In the 2040 plans, they were mostly suburban. There was a couple of suburban edge and a couple of emerging suburban edge communities that are now identified as suburban in the 2050 designations. The lowest densities in both of the 2030 and 2040 plans were just like 3 or just above 3, but the existing density is much lower than that. Again, I want you to look at the trend of the densities in the charts in the 2030 and 2040 plans and where the existing density generally tends to fall. In the suburban edge communities, 2050 designation suburban edge communities, you'll see that the densities will go very low all of a sudden, and with the lowest of 1 in both 2030 and 2040 plans. I guess, again, those are kind of anomalies because, as I said, we wouldn't authorize plans that are inconsistent with our minimum density requirements, except in certain circumstances that is limited growth and or limited capacity, and so that would be that kind of a circumstance. But the existing density, as you'll see, is pretty low. We did make sure to, like I said, not include areas that were outside of MUSA in here, because otherwise it was even lower than this, because these communities do include, these are the edge of the core within MUSA.
And in your existing, do you exclude steep slopes and wetlands and things from the calculations, or did those get sucked into there?
I think some of those were excluded, but not necessarily at the site plan level.
Because that could create a lot of variation in what the actual density is versus the reported numbers.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I did include rural centers as well, because even though they're not part of the Metropolitan Urban Service Area, they're part of the rural service area. That's a new category I'm creating. Kyle, did you note that? Generally speaking, these communities are on their own wastewater treatment facility. Some of them we have plans for very, very, very long-term plans for potentially taking over these facilities. That's why they have minimum density requirements, and even though they're separated from the system, they tend to be a little lower on the density, and in some cases, and you may remember we've had amendments that have made them fall below, but they don't become conformance issues in those situations because they are on their own system. So, but the interesting thing for me here is that these rural centers existing, even the lowest of the existing density is still higher than the suburban edge areas, or some of the suburban areas. And that just generally shows that they tend to be much denser than some of the core of the region, if you will. Before I move to our discussion questions, I included these proposed regional goals because I just wanted us to have like a refresher of what our regional goals are, because our land use policies will be based on these goals, trying to meet these goals. So our region is equitable and inclusive, our communities are healthy and safe, the region is dynamic and resilient, will lead on addressing climate change, and we protect and restore natural systems. These goals have been endorsed by the council, and our regional planning process is based on these goals moving forward and incorporating them into different policies. So, taking all of that into consideration, as the trends that you saw between the planned densities versus existing densities, and some of the goals that we have, but I want to now pose a question to you. What can you observe from this information? And I know I said some of the things myself. Try to ignore what I said, if you can't forget it. But what is it that you observe that stands out to you, that you believe, wow, that's very interesting, or that we should look more into it, or that it's something noteworthy that we should definitely address? That's the first question I have for you. One of the most important questions that I would like to ask you is that you saw that there is a difference between existing density and planned density. That being said, I did say that the existing density includes all housing there is, regardless of age. However, in general, that just shows that the pattern of development within our communities are generally lower densities than we may think. What do you believe are the challenges that communities face potentially in meeting those densities, like actually developing them, not meeting them in the plans? And how do you think they may be different from one community to another? I will stop right there and not go into further questions and just invite everybody to speak.
Thoughts?
Well, I'd say we're seeing it in real time. The market is driving density today, and you're seeing that everywhere. Higher density, but I think individually to communities having clarity around wetlands and stormwater becomes a real issue when I'm looking specifically at my community and certain developments if I have a lot of wetlands. So I think from a LUAC land use advisory, we need to be very clear what you're saying there, and how could the areas be modified because of land or certain areas.
And I've noticed that some places put wetlands in outlots and some leave them as part of the lot under a conservation easement or something to keep people from building on them. But that makes a big difference in what your calculated density. There's no difference in what's on the ground, but it makes a big difference in your calculated density, and we should be consistent on that throughout the region rather than penalizing some places for how they draw the lines on their plat. That's my thought. I don't know what the rest of you guys think about that.
I would agree. We should have just some guidance around that, or adjustments, or some suggested standardization of how it should be treated.
I mean, from a maintenance standpoint, it's a lot easier for the city if the wetland is in an outlot. If you need to dredge it up, if there's parts of it that are filling up with sediment or something and you need to clean it out, or stormwater ponds, that having them in an outlot really makes it easier to do the maintenance. But like I said, there's some communities like Andover, I've seen plats up there where they have a wetland or a stormwater pond that all of the lot lines go. And you might have an acre lot that's actually a third of an acre because 2/3 of it is underwater or in a wetland area. So.
And we do in minimum, for net density calculations, we do take all of that out. We rely heavily on the communities themselves for that reporting, especially because like in a program like plat monitoring program, when it is very project specific, they have the best calculated number as opposed to the wetland inventory, which is not very accurate necessarily. So even in the plans, like comprehensive plans, what we are looking for is always the net residential density so that communities are not penalized for if they're in a very wet area. What that means though is that, and there's some things that cannot be taken out, like local roads. What that means is that we're hoping that those platting and development patterns are the most efficient so that they take the best advantage of the available land, so that they're not, if in that, maybe in such an area with so many wetlands, they shouldn't be cul-de-sacs, for example, so that it's the best use of that land. So that's what we're hoping to encourage in some of those areas for communities.
We moved on to the questions,
Yeah,
John.
I do have questions, and I'm sorry I missed that piece. I had a kid thing. May I ask a question?
Of course.
Or respond to this in general? Some of the, as a local official, like we've stayed pretty close to our 3. And as far as I'm concerned, there's a fine line between, like I understand there should be some density requirements for the sewer system, but I also I think some of these density requirements that are above the sewer system requirements, like the functionality of things, get away from, take some of the reasons why cities don't like them at council is because they are heavy-handed, appear to be from our perspective. And I think that some of the changing of the expected densities and then basically using the community designation as a new way to have expectations and change the expectations for so changing the expectations of density based on these community designations, I think it kind of oversimplifies things, in my opinion. I hope we don't change the 3 per in our town. It wouldn't be necessary. That would be a question I would have, is it gonna be expected to stay the same? Can we expect it to stay 3 to 5?
Madam Chair, I think at this point we are just exploring, honestly. There isn't any specific promise one way or another, but we're trying to see what the trend is telling us and how it aligns with the goals that were identified and endorsed by the council, and what is the best route forward. Considering that, going back to both the 2040 plans, but also thinking how are we growing based on different scenarios potentially, and you've heard some of the scenario planning presentations and more coming.
Do you have, so one of the questions is what challenges do we face in meeting minimum density? Do you know what is Corcoran's minimum, what is our density today? Do you know it?
I know what the planned density is and what the existing density is. Which one would you like?
The existing density.
It's 0.9.
So I don't know where you get that from, because every single new development is 3.
So I would have to look into that more closely, and I apologize because this is, like I said, it's not just new development, it is all of the cities that is within MUSA, including anything that was built maybe 20 years ago. That being said, Corcoran and most other cities still have land use designations and that their minimum range or the range of the designation is quite low. So the low density residential category in some of the communities is 1 to 3 units an acre. The communities are definitely going and approving permits and new developments within those ranges, and that is still consistent with their comprehensive plan. And that's how, going back to the earlier question that you had, that is how the density keeps coming down, because you're still consistent with your plan, but you are permitting it at the densities that are lower.
So let me get this straight. Like, say you had 5-acre lots with septic in your community. That land becomes available for sewer, so it's in the MUSA. They may or may not have actually hooked up to it. The parcels around them are redeveloping as single-family neighborhoods, but that 5-acre lot still counts towards the density, so it brings the overall existing density down. Is that correct?
In this one method of calculating existing density, it would,
Okay.
if it was based on the 2020 generalized land use.
Yes.
Remember, like that's the most recent, best information that we have that was double checked and confirmed. So it may, like something like that may have not been included yet, but yes, that is the general answer is yes.
So I would say that a challenge that we face in meeting our minimum density is the actual way you guys measure it. Because this isn't meant to be computational. I'm just saying that if you're saying we need to be 3 to 5, and you're saying today we're at less than 1, and since I've been on council, every single development that we've approved has been 3 or more, then the data's not correct. Or how you guys are purporting that we're, your measurements show us not meeting the density requirements if it's 0.9.
If I may interject there, we don't, even though I'm showing the existing densities, but we don't say that the communities are or are not meeting the minimum density requirement as a policy of the council based on existing development. It's the planned development, planned densities that are what we're looking for. And in some of these, and we're trying to kind of.
Oh, so we have bare land in our MUSA area. Sure. One house with 100 acres.
So that's what drives it down, is what I'm saying.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
And it would treat it differently depending if it was, say it was a gravel mine or something that then gets redeveloped as housing. The gravel mine wouldn't count as residential land while it's a gravel mine.
Correct.
Yeah,
Whereas,
because it's not.
If you've got some 10-acre lots that eventually become housing and have come inside the MUSA, they would count against your existing density where the gravel mine would. Am I getting this right?
Okay, so you went from planned density to existing density, am I correct?
I'm talking about existing density, when you're figuring out your existing density calculation. And you have a community that, say, in 2015 had a gravel mine that's going to be future housing, and next door there's some 10-acre lots with septic tanks with houses that are also going to be future housing. Those 10-acre lots count against your density inside the MUSA when the MUSA comes over that area, but they wouldn't count in the gravel mine because that's a industrial use, basically. So the calculations themselves are not very helpful because of the way that you're calculating it in places.
Well, the calculation is meant to just show what is on the ground at the moment, as in, that is our, generally speaking, not this number that I showed necessarily. A similar, like say plat monitoring, for example, that is showing the most recent actual development activity that's happening is meant to show that this is what's going on versus what the community was hoping that would happen. With the best of intention, don't get me wrong, but sometimes the market is shifting a certain way. The developers are coming in with proposals that tend to be at maybe the lower end of your category that would not require a comprehensive plan amendment either. It's still consistent with your plan, but it just happens to be that you said between 5 and 15 units an acre. This happens to be 5, not 10. So that's what we were trying to get at slightly. So then that's what we generally see even within the plat monitoring program. And I think one thing that I can do is that with the communities that do have or are members of the plat monitoring program, we can redo
that better.
Yeah, we can redo this information so that to show that, but there's only 45 communities that are part of the plat monitoring program, and I should say that half of them are not meeting the minimum density requirements, are in fact pretty low. So in many of those instances, we don't include the plat monitoring information in when we review the comprehensive plans because it will work against the community. In fact, we're giving communities credit even though their most recent development activity shows that they are below.
Well, and especially in the last few years with the pandemic and people changing, working from home and wanting bigger spaces, that has driven an increase in single family beyond what we expected to happen this decade. But like you said before, apartment buildings tend to come at the end of a city's development, not as much at the beginning, unless they're subsidized. The subsidized ones can come at any time, but the market rate stuff tends to come towards the end. I mean, I've lived in one of the fastest growing communities in the region for more than 30 years, and it used to be almost all single family, and now there's scads of apartment buildings that are going up. There's still a lot of single family, but much more apartments because the price of land is getting to the point where it's cost prohibitive to do single family anymore. I don't know how much our land use, our minimum densities help or change anything other than maybe holding off development sometimes when the number is wrong. Because a lot of times the developers look around where they're going to get an option and they find out what the planned density is and they pay the amount of money based on what that planned density is. But if that's not what the market wants, it's not like they're going to go to the landowner and say, hey, cut your price down by a third because we want to do single family homes. So that development just doesn't happen for a while.
How does your information, your data, in Carver County, the cities that are growing the fastest have Met Council waste treatment and water. Ones that don't have their own water towers, and they're not growing very much because as population increases, the cost of putting up these facilities is outrageous, and they can't afford it. They don't have the population to pay for it quite yet, and you're unable to get grants, grants from like bonding bills and stuff. So how does that play into your data? Whereas communities that don't have, the pleasure of Met Council facilities compared to their own, how does that play into that data like that?
Chair, the way that it plays into the data is in the minimum density requirements in this case. So in the previously, and since for the longest time, I don't even know when that came about, maybe or you can tell, that it was defined that the 3 units an acre is the minimum that of development, or new development rather, that is efficient for the wastewater treatment system, the regional wastewater system. And that was used for the minimum densities of some of these, like the edge of the regions. Like if the lowest that you can be if you are connected to the system is 3 units an acre, basically. And then the similarly for some of the rural centers, as I mentioned, even though they are part of or on their own facilities because of some long-term plans for growth and long-term service areas, they are still at 3 units an acre. So that's how it plays into it, but not sure how else would potentially play into the data itself. It plays certainly into policies associated with the designations potentially and some of the development patterns that we're seeing in some of these communities, but not in the data, I don't think.
Sure. Yeah. Back to the measurement of the existing density and the example with the gravel mine. When you do the calculation of existing density, if the gravel mine was guided for residential, would that be counted as against the existing density for residential, even though it was actually not sitting there as, it was still being used as a gravel mine, but it had been guided and, perhaps zoned for residential for future use? Do you count that then as part of the
non-conforming use almost?
Yeah, exactly.
My understanding is that that is not how the generalized land use is set up, that they're fact checked based on what is actually underground.
Got it. I just wanted to clarify that point because I could see where that would impact the numbers differently than how it was being discussed if it worked that way. So I appreciate that clarification.
And a lot of higher density development goes onto parcels that weren't zoned residential, dead strip malls, or like Burnsville's had a whole bunch of apartment buildings going up on land that was guided for corporate campuses that nobody wanted to put a corporate campus on. And when they finally gave up on that and changed it to residential, they've had thousands of units of apartments going up in just the space of a couple of years.
That's what we've experienced. I mean, in our last comp plan update, we guided a lot of property that didn't have any residential on it as mixed use, added residential as a component because that helped all of our density, meeting our minimum densities. And it gave developers flexibility to build what the market was calling for. So that's kind of the opposite of a challenge, but I think that the challenge we all face is that, existing uses don't necessarily change over that quickly. And so especially in, primarily, well, it's both in really developed communities and even communities that are sort of developing much more slowly, the status quo just stays the status quo for a long time. And so, these minimum standards for new development don't necessarily push the needle on what's actually on the ground very quickly. Like in our case, we've got, I think, something like 2/3 of our community is single-family homes, and they actually meet our minimum lot requirements. So it's not too likely that they're going to try to squeeze more homes very quickly onto those lots. So it's going to take us a long time for the community as a whole to get close to what the minimum standard is for new development. But I think the idea is that minimum standard for new development helps to move towards those density goals. And I think what we've been able to do is we've been able to guide areas with more density that aren't converting single-family homes necessarily to more density, but rather other types of uses and or thinking about where we put specifically designated high-density housing as we guide property going forward. So that's been our strategy. And certainly everything, I think with the exception of maybe 2 10 to 12 unit developments over the last 5 years, everything has been developed as multifamily in Rosemead.
Bill?
I'd just say approving a lot of developments, all builders will beat the 3 units per acre today because of cost. We're down to 5-foot setbacks. Pulte, David Weekly, Lennar, they're even moving now to slab on grade 2-story homes just to get that cost price point down. So it's up to councils really. Builders will build higher density very easily because of these price points if you're willing to modify your setbacks, because it is the cost. Now buyers, I see it clearly. Baby boomers still hanging on to wanting big lots. Millennials and below, hey, they want the home, but they don't want the yard. And the market's showing they're selling.
Plus, I was going to say, to do the single family with larger lots, the price point just keeps moving up.
Correct.
Basically.
So just seeing, and speaking of mining, we have 1,700 acres mining. And it's all industrial zoned currently. And they're only allowed to have 80 acres open at a time, which is immaterial as far as the total mining, but as they reclaim, we haven't, or the city hasn't gone back and rezone it, but they will someday when it's sold off. Then it'll be changed to the comp guide plan as residential. Once it takes that zoning, then it's in your calculations.
Yeah, it seems to me to get a more accurate calculation of existing density, you should restrict it to ones that are actually hooked up to the sewer system. So things that are on an acreage that just hasn't been redeveloped yet shouldn't count against the existing density. I mean,
within MUSUP, but
yes.
Not connected?
Yes. That
Well,
would give
no,
you a
I'd
more accurate.
sort of argue that point because we also have a couple hundred acres that the majority of the council did not want smaller land and they want it rural, and you're putting new homes out on large lots yet.
Is it with sewer or
No.
without?
Without, go Credit River, all the big acreages, why wouldn't you count? Even though they're not on the NUSA, or on the sewer water.
I'm talking about the ones that are going to redevelop. I'm not talking about ones that they're putting up that to keep it as a permanent use.
Well, and how do you know what's going to redevelop 30 years from now?
It's talking about existing, not about,
Oh.
about future.
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
What about wetlands?
That's what Madam Chair has asked as well. I believe that they I'm not sure whether or not they were included in this information. So I did double check the methodology behind the data, and I can't for sure say yes or no.
Okay.
So we'll definitely look into that and get back to you
So
and make sure that if we can, take it up,
and we have,
because we do take it up.
so, do you wanna go?
No, go ahead, finish what you're saying.
We have specific challenges in our area. That's one of the questions is, there's a quest for green space. And then also we have so much in the way of wetlands. And when we get into watershed permitting, there are certain areas that are forbidden from having any housing at all. And then we have like 250-year-old oak stands that to meet the required density, people are having to shave them down. And so it's not and then when you end up trying to keep the oak stands and trying to keep some of the scenic beauty or just the natural lay of the landscape, you always end up like shortcutting, taking out old trees, flattening areas that maybe wouldn't be able to withstand housing, and then filling in wetlands. And so it's a challenge to come up with interesting communities that, it's like they all look the same. And also it's a challenge to come up with, in some cases, even where you put everything because of the wetlands or the trees or whatever you kind of want to keep, but we have to take them down to meet these requirements.
I see a lot of places where if they know they're going to be developed, if it's a pasture or whatever, and they know they're going to be developing as housing in the next couple of years, they'll clear cut the whole thing while it's a pasture to get around the tree preservation requirements, because they want to grade it to maximize how many lots can get on there. So you lose generally all of the trees on anything except for the ones with the really big lots with executive homes on them, just to maximize how many houses. So there's conflicting desires there between protecting trees and density, definitely.
I've noted that. I do want to also say though that now it's not in this specific calculation necessarily, because it's very big, generalized, but overall for net density calculation, it is the council's policy that if there are ordinances for like natural resource preservation, such as tree preservation, those are areas that can be excluded from net density calculation. So that is already part of our policy. And so they don't have to take down the trees as long as the city has acted and has some kind of a natural resource preservation ordinance in place.
What about a bonus system or something?
There's no bonus system, but
No, if the city has a bonus system based on natural resource preservation.
Well, some cities will set up like a greenway plan, and so they'll preserve the trees, maybe put a trail through them, and take that land as like a park dedication.
Mhm.
But a lot of times, the builders, like I said, will cut everything down before that process even happens, because you can get more lots.
When you almost have to have like an easement of some sort on the property in order to make it part of the calculation, because our tree preservation ordinance just talks about if you take down so many, you have to add so many back. You're not gonna be able to figure that out in doing the
No.
calculations on any given property unless you knew that this portion of property was trees only or whatever, and it was by law or by
Yeah.
easement or something like that. So
But
it's not perfect either that way.
No.
Yeah, the city almost has to get that easement going
It's control
before the
property.
development is even talked about, to make sure that the trees don't get cut down
And then you
before
get
they.
accused of taking.
Well, but cities have to be flexible also. So when you say 3 units to acre, as a developer, I can cluster and throw high density and preserve woodlands and wetlands, but if you're not flexible, that's when quite often it's removed.
Yeah,
And that fear of higher density sometimes overrides your goals on preserving natural areas.
If I may tag on that and maybe ask some of the other questions. You mentioned maybe clustering the development, for example. I know that's one of the areas that we don't, I mean, we have policies, but more on the side of encouraging communities that is what we hope you do. Do you see, or do you have ideas regarding how that can be best put forward from a regional perspective as a policy associated with minimum density? Did I say that well?
I think especially on your outer ring and small communities, I'd have language in there early on the front end comp guide when you go out to communities, that through cluster development, it gives you flexibility to preserve natural areas unique to certain communities, etc.
So still open-ended, more like
Encouraging
encourage you to do
and
this?
now I know was it Iowa State several years ago had a great example of a development of land and how they clustered, developed, and were able to retain, and you might have to have an example, etc. Or when you have planners or elected officials on those outer rings, explain and show an example of what cluster development would do for you. But it will create higher densities, but small lots.
I think that meets some of the other goals in terms of sustainability and dealing with stormwater issues and all those types of things. And so encouraging cities to put in place flexible standards that achieve some of the other objectives while maintaining the average density on a particular site is maybe a way to put that together.
we've had to do that when people come in and some of our areas are zoned that you can't have townhouses, for example. Well, if you don't put in like we've had situations where if you don't put in townhouses, you actually will not be able to meet the 3 per, like, and we have lot size minimums, and we have, no 3-car garages, and all the, in certain zones and stuff like that. So we have had to get flexible on density to be able to meet, neighborhoods might have townhouses and then also 55 or 60 or 70 foot lot sizes to meet the 3, but you had to get creative inside of it.
Well, I'd say builders will work with you. David Weekly, they're in with a 2-story or 2-stall garage, 2-story home. Haven't had them for 20 years. They have sold 3, have built 15, but I mean, markets change, and I talked to the office 3-4 months ago, do you think people will buy these? With a concern, and they were up on Northwest Metro with 3 stall, but they're moving to 2.
Yeah, it just,
And Americans have stuff, and we all have, you have that third stall in the market, yeah, I need space, but there's a cost, especially when you look at infrastructure and densities.
And there are a lot of opportunities to do cool things with working
Correct.
around wetlands and stanza trees and stuff, but you've gotta have the developer willing to work too. If it's cheaper for them to create everything and they can get more lots out of it, it's hard to make them do something more creative.
Yeah,
It's usually gonna be more
put in
expensive.
place planned unit developments where specifically people can exchange more density for preserving those types of things. And since we put it in place probably 5 years ago, I don't think we've had any developments come in under that. We have also added the ability to rezone single-family residential to like a more dense single-family residential from what it is now, but we didn't, as a city, sort of designate areas. We left that to developers to ask for it, and that hasn't really taken off either. So we've tried to be flexible, but I think encouraging that from the official level is probably not a bad idea too.
Oh,
We're out of
second,
time.
out of time, yes. I did get some input from you, which is very useful, thank you, in terms of making sure that how else we can refine the data for specifically existing density and see how we can do better comparison. If you think of another thought or idea or question later on as you're pondering on this, maybe not too long, just reach out to me, and you'll have my contact information on the info item as well. I'm happy to and look forward to receive any additional feedback from you.
And I'm a geek, so I think about this stuff all the time.
Yes.
But can you send out the spreadsheet of who had what, so I can see what those outliers are and try to understand the data better?
Absolutely, I can certainly do that, just with the caveat that it may include all the wetlands and all the housing ever built, but yes, I will do that. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so next up we have scenario planning water findings.
It's gonna be a lot of us.
So we'll spread out.
You need Noah to move around.
Yeah, I can move if you all want to.
Noah can, yeah,
Yes,
Noah, why don't you move
maybe.
around?
Yeah,
the
where you
other
are.
side? Oh, they'll sit on both sides.
It's actually gonna take a while.
Yeah.
So who's in charge?
I get to go first, I don't
Fine,
think I'm in
fine.
charge.
It's always
I gotta leave at 6 for another meeting, so.
Okay, well, we're
we're adjourned.
trying to be out of here by 6. We'll gavel before then. Okay.
Hello, Madam Chair, hello, committee members. My name is Jen Kostrzewski. I'm the Assistant Manager of Water Planning and Policy for Environmental Services. There are a bunch of others of us that will be presenting. We thought that diverse narration would help with the presentation. So hopefully as each of my colleagues does their part, they'll introduce themselves as they get the mic. We are here to share some of our findings specific to our water planning and how they were associated with some scenario plannings that we did through the Regional Development Guide planning process. Some of our other colleagues came to earlier sessions to share about housing and other system areas, so it's our turn to come on up and share about water. Just as a general overview, we are going to share a little bit about the water resources policy plan and system plan and what the update process is for that document. We're going to do a little bit of the scenario planning recap, and then we're going to get into our findings from surface water, water supply, and wastewater systems. So for those 3 different areas, how the scenarios play it out. But before we really get into that, I do want to give you some background about what water responsibilities that the council has for the region. We are a regional water supply planning agency, so we don't provide water supplies to the residents of the region, but we help local suppliers plan for water supplies to ensure that we have sustainable waters for the residents. Additionally, we have surface water management planning responsibilities, and so that covers rivers, lakes, streams, and stormwater management. So when water hits the surface, where it goes and how we're able to live amongst that water within the region is important for that planning aspect. And we partner with our watersheds in the region to help accommodate that work, And then lastly, we do operate the regional wastewater system. And so hopefully through these different areas, our residents do touch the work we work with on every day within environmental services. And so it's our connection point. Water's foundational, and we hope that you can see some of that as we're thinking about land use and water through our presentation. Even though I talked about 3 separate systems in which our residents and our work connect, in reality, water is connected on the landscape everywhere. If a drop of water falls through rain, which unfortunately we haven't had much of that because we are in a drought, but if we do have rain, it can run into a river, which could become drinking water for someone in their house, and then that could move through the treatment system and eventually get back to the river. So even though we talk about water in these various aspects of the water cycle, it is all connected, and that's something to keep in mind as we are doing our planning. And so we call that integrated water planning. And so we try to keep in mind that water doesn't necessarily follow where our institutional boundaries are. It goes where water tends to go. So again, just to be a little bit more specific on how we serve the region, we operate wastewater collection and treatment services for the region. We do wastewater planning. We have water quality, which is water surface monitoring and watershed planning, so we have that role. And then lastly, we have water supply planning, and we also operate through that role efficiency grants in which we help communities think about conservation and efficiencies so that we're not using our potable waters as intensely. So we're trying to think about being a little bit more wise with how we use our waters. All of that work is encapsulated inside of the Water Resources Policy Plan. This is a plan which will be part and has been a part of the Regional Development Guide. So that the 2050 Water Resources Policy Plan, which is the one that we are currently starting to formulate, draft, and pull together, will focus on ensuring ensuring sustainable water resources within the region. It also provides that framework for thinking about water holistically. So again, not just looking at it through the lens of surface water, but thinking about it across from supply, wastewater, and surface water holistically. It will contain policies, strategies, and actions for both the council and the region. So it's a plan that covers both our own internal direction and hopefully is in alignment with the regional vision set with the Regional Development Guide. It will be. That's right, it will. And then lastly, it's an opportunity for our policies to commit the council to take actions in areas of long-range visioning, planning, regional investment, our own facility management, technical assistance, research, assessment, and partnerships. At the bottom is a timeline, and Judy will touch on this as we get towards the end of the presentation, but I just want to say that the end date for all of this is the end of 2024, where we hope all of the plans that we are working with for the Regional Development Guide will be adopted by the council. When we first started off with scenario planning, we knew that we'd get some really good insights, and I'm not going to spoil any of them for you. Those are coming a little bit later. But we knew that there were some other key considerations that might not come up with the scenarios and how the scenarios were established. And so we wanted to make sure that you also keep these considerations in mind as we're thinking about land use policies, and guidelines for the region. One of the things that just comes true because of state planning structure, water planning structure, but also just common sense is that we need to collaborate. No one agency has the answer for water, or frankly, I would say no one agency has the water for any topic area. It's through conversation and integrating various perspectives that really allows us to see that big picture. And that definitely holds true with water. Like we mentioned before, we're not a water supplier, and so it's important to bring those voices into the picture. We have our watershed management partners as well. That's a vital voice when we're thinking about all of this. So it's that collaboration across all of the different water professionals that really allow us to see the true picture for our region. The other thing to consider is infrastructure. You were discussing it a little bit earlier. As we figure out what our densities are, that really impacts our infrastructure. And the further we build out into the region, that's more infrastructure for us to maintain. So something to keep in mind as we're making these land use choices. climate is going to be at the forefront of all of the work we do. Unfortunately, nothing that the council does won't be touched by it. And so it's something we need to keep in mind. For water, we're thinking about both times of abundance. So if you remember earlier this year, we actually had high waters and floods in the river. And situations like now, conditions like now, in which we're experiencing some drought, some scarce water. I wish I had more water in my yard to make it a little bit greener, but we are where we are. And so it's keeping that planning in mind as we think about not just my front yard, but our water infrastructure for the region and how people interact with water. And then the last part about people and water, we also have to keep in mind that not all of our communities experience water the same, and each of those experiences are valid. And so we know from history that we have made some choices that have impacted certain communities. And we need to, as we move forward and make policies and planning decisions, keep vulnerable communities in mind. Just put that tagline up there, let's not repeat history, but instead let's repair it. And so that's one of the things that we want to make that keeping to the high point of our considerations as we think about water within this region. Raya was able to share some of our regional goals, and we wanted to show how we can have water measures that can connect to those 5 areas. And I hope some of this comes remarkably clear as we're sharing some of our results later in this presentation. But for instance, if we focus on our regional goal of healthy, safe communities, we can see that every single one of these measures that we've highlighted from a water standpoint have direct connections to that goal. And so as we're developing our goals and as we're developing our policies within water, we're going to hopefully, we will, again, not hopefully, have these measures that can help us keep track of our obligations to our goals. So we'll make sure that we can start seeing some accountability and some outcomes for the work that we do. And so with that, I'm going to hand this to my colleague, Emily.
Thank you. So, hi all, my name is Emily Resseger. I'm an environmental analyst in water resources alongside of Jen. My work focuses on surface water planning and assessment, so I'm going to show some of the higher level results from our scenario planning around surface water. So I'm going to focus the scenario planning results today around nitrate and chloride. We also investigated water volume runoff and phosphorus as part of this, but I don't have time to discuss those today, so I'll talk about nitrate and chloride. We have plenty to share with you all as is, but I'd be happy to answer any questions later about phosphorus and water volume if you're interested. For this scenario planning, we used a simplified rainfall runoff model, and I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of that, but to investigate all these different scenarios. The 2 biggest drivers for that modeling are climate inputs and land use. Since the scenario planning effort really focused around density and distribution of growth, land use change was the primary driver for all of these scenario outputs. Then the primary land use change that drove all of this is agricultural and undeveloped land converting to single-family residential, and I'll show you some information on that in a little bit. So we focused on nitrate as one of the outcomes in surface waters because it's a key pollutant for the council to investigate both on a local scale that impacts our local streams, rivers, and lakes. And it's also likely to be a pollutant that will be included in our future wastewater treatment plant permits. A primary source of nitrate is fertilizer on running off agricultural fields, but it does have urban sources like pet waste, fertilizer, and leaf fall litter. So why we care about nitrate is that nitrogen running off of our streams and lakes can cause excess algae growth, which makes lakes unpleasant to swim in, and it impacts our aquatic communities. And then in addition, nitrate leaves the metro by way of the Mississippi River and enters the Gulf of Mexico, where it contributes to the dead zone. As part of our state partnerships, we're required to focus on reducing nitrate. Chloride is the other pollutant we'll talk about today. You all have probably heard about chloride. It's been in the news a lot. In the metro, it primarily comes from road salt, but it does also have sources of road salt for de-icing, but it does also have sources of water softeners, fertilizer, and animal waste. Chloride is something we care about because at high levels it can be toxic to aquatic life, so we have a state standard, and more of our urban waters are becoming impaired for chloride. And chloride is of most concern for our small lakes and streams because those are ones that don't have enough flow volume to dilute its impacts.
Madam Chair.
Yes,
Can we ask questions during the presentation?
yeah, if you're quite.
Because you'd said that you work with local watersheds in multiple different ways, it sounds like. In the context of this presentation, how is it that you work with local watersheds?
Yeah, Madam Chair. We work in partnership with them. We serve in a technical advisory committee role, and we also have a role in reviewing their local water plans. It's not an enforcement capability, it's more of a partnership. I don't know how to do it.
So on a watershed meeting, you'll have a technical advisory committee meeting before the watershed meeting, the reps, local reps. Would you be on that? Or is Hennepin County, I think, is on our technical advisory committee for our watershed?
So, Madam Chair, so we work with the watersheds. Typically, we work with them more extensively when they're updating their watershed plans. So then, yes, we would sit on, and we have different staff that would go to these meetings, as well as Hennepin County would be in your watershed that you're
Okay.
part of. But the other thing we also do, which Emily did not mention, is we also monitor a lot of the area lakes, rivers, and streams, and then we do that in great partnership with our watersheds because we monitor about 200 lakes a year, and we could not do that alone if we didn't have partners from our watersheds looking for volunteers to help monitor the conditions of those resources.
Okay.
I would also add that one of the themes I'm going to get into is that surface water management is very localized and it's really different throughout the metro. So we may be involved, one watershed may ask us to be much more intimately involved with their technical advisory planning or our monitoring partnerships, while other watersheds sort of tend to do things themselves and we'll just maybe come in as an advisory role. So it just really depends on each one.
I'm gonna ask a question because I look at these maps.
Mm-hmm.
And I was on our watershed and I live on it in Bear Creek. One of the things that our watershed has is a matching requirement. So our watershed is Dayton, Corcoran, Maple Grove, Plymouth, a little bit of Greenfield. And there are projects that we do, and the match, if you look at this map of where the loads are coming from, it's like areas like Corcoran. We're kind of a big contributor to loads. And then if they have a match requirement, like they might have a project that is a huge, it's a big number that we can't afford, but Maple Grove can. So, but their impact to the watershed is less than ours. But because they have a match requirement on the watershed level, the projects that our watershed does is in the areas where they have bigger budgets rather than the areas where they have a higher impact. And it's a kind of a source of frustration because we are in the beginning stages of development. We have a lot of farms. We haven't historically had water preserving strategies and techniques, but it's hard to get them going when the majority of the dollars spent by the watershed are spent in areas that are already developed because they can meet the match requirement. And so I would love it if we could kind of work collaboratively to help areas where we can make a bigger impact even if we can't meet the match.
And that's helpful to know. We need to go pretty fast through this information because we're running out of time.
I know, I'm sorry. Water is a passion of mine, so.
Thank you for that comment, and that's something I think you can chat about later. So yeah, I'll try to get through this pretty quick. So as I said, the modeling we did for surface water was primarily driven by land use change. So I just wanted to chat a little bit about how that was reflected in the modeling. So this plot shows the bar above the 0% shows land use that's going to be increasing. in the next 30 years, so this is 2020 to 2050 comparison. So that's land use will be increasing, and what's below the 0% line is the land that's going to be consumed to make way for that new development. And so basically what this shows is that high dispersed, the high dispersed scenario, you guys I think heard about scenarios in the previous meeting, but of those 5, high dispersed is likely to see the most land use change, but at 8.5% of the metro. Low compact is being shown in this modeling to be around 2.7% of land use change. And I show this because to me, none of this is a huge change, especially as we compare to all the development that's happened over the last 150 years. The scenarios we're looking at were not designed to investigate extreme development patterns. They were designed to model 5 different scenarios that could realistically happen in the next 30 years. And that's sort of what this is showing. And the other thing I wanted to point out is the way we modeled this, almost all of the development is shown to be single-family residential, which is what's shown in that gold. And in each of these scenarios, more than 90% or more of the land being developed is shown to be single-family residential. That'll kick it. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then what we're consuming for that single-family residential is what's shown below the line, and that's a mix of agricultural and undeveloped vacant land. And that undeveloped or vacant land covers both sort of areas in the more rural part, like forests and meadows, but as well as urban and suburban redevelopment and infill. So we're going to be converting in the next 30 years undeveloped and vacant and agriculture to developed land uses, and mostly it's shown, at least in this process, to be single-family residential. So the first result I wanted to talk about is nitrate. And so the plots here all show the difference in nitrate runoff, which would be in like pounds. So you can imagine like a weight, a mass of pollution. And it's all in percentage change from 2020. So on the left, we see an overall summary of how nitrate runoff into our water bodies is going to differ from 2020 conditions, and they're all negative percentages. They're all expected to decrease by 2050, and that's because nitrate pollution is highest running off of agricultural fields. So as part of that land is consumed for development, the runoff coming off of field, or the runoff coming off our land is going to decrease in nitrogen as we consume agricultural land. What we're showing is that the decrease is most in the high dispersed, because that high dispersed scenario is where the most acres of land are going to be consumed. And the least is shown for low compact. That's where less development is going to happen. It's going to be in the urban core, which more of that is going to be redevelopment or densification. So less ag land is going to be consumed, and that means less of a reduction in nitrate. The maps to the right, they show the metro broken up into the 37 major watersheds that drain to our local streams, and we decided to show this with watersheds because where we see the impact is on our streams and lakes, so that's how we want to model it. And the colors show how nitrate is decreasing, and so the dark purple is the most decreased, all the way down to negative 36%, and then all the way up to the light and purple and the yellow are slight decreases or increases. And so low compact in the lower left show a slight decrease or very slight increase across all watersheds, which is consistent with more development happening in the urban core. Then the high dispersed map, which is in the upper right, show that nitrate is likely to go down more in certain rural areas, like I would point out northern Anoka County or southern Carver County, as compared to other rural areas like Scott County. And those are sort of artifacts of how the modeling occurred, of where the thought is that more development may occur, but it really brings home the point that on the right or on the left, we're showing overall how things are changing, but it's not going to change uniformly across the metro. Really, these water quality impacts are going to happen very locally. They're going to impact our local surface waters. So summarizing things at the metro scale can leave out a lot of that nuance. Yes?
I'd like to ask you a question. You talk about runoff from agricultural land. Now, most farm land is tiled. So do you consider water that flows through tiles runoff?
Madam Chair, in this general, when we're talking about runoff here, it's anything that's sort of resulting from rainfall hitting the landscape. So yes, because tile is a very short-circuited surface runoff, it is considered to be part of surface runoff in this analysis, yes.
Well, if you talk to farmers, I live out in the farm country, farmers will say, well, the folks that live in town that live on tarred streets, they're the ones doing the polluting because they don't read the directions. They say, oh, I'll put this bag on my lawn and it runs onto the tarred streets down the storm drains. So farmers will say, well, we only fertilize as much as we need to get a good crop. And so they'll say, well, we don't pollute the waters. So you come up with these maps and stuff where, I'd like to know how, it seems like you blame the farmers for most of the pollution, but they'll say it's the city folks that do the pollution.
Oh, Madam Chair, one, I'd say hang on, because things are going to change on the next slide. But two, these models are just that, they're high-level models using average numbers that have been gathered from a lot of field work over time. They don't explain individual farm field activity, and they're really meant to be more comparative. So yes, we're showing that I think long-term modeling or long-term measurements show that ag fields generally contribute more nitrate than other land uses. So we're showing that nitrate will decrease if we develop those ag fields, but I think I would also really focus on the changes between the different scenarios and the relative differences, because I agree, certain farm fields don't contribute very much. Certain residential users probably put too much nitrate on their lawns. This is sort of a high-level summary, but the goal, and like you'll see on the next slide, is that different land uses are causing different challenges, and it really depends.
I mean, have you tested waters and everything that are located around farm fields that come up with this numbers?
Yes, these numbers are from they are from like edge of field measurements. They're sort of optimal or average results. I think history and monitoring has shown that nitrate often is higher running off of agricultural fields, but they are generalized.
But doesn't nitrate kind of evaporate though? Isn't that? Nowadays farmers use gas to get their nitrogen, and a lot of it leaks out into the atmosphere, not into the water, right?
I think some does, but we are seeing in monitoring data really high nitrate values in more agricultural dominated areas. Like that's what our monitoring data shows.
So it is monitored and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, it's actual testing of the water,
Yeah.
Well,
not the air.
Yeah.
Okay. Keep going.
Yeah. So this slide, same layout as the last one. It's about chloride. It has a really different message. So in all scenarios, chloride loading is likely to increase by 2050. Like I said earlier, chloride pollution is primarily from road salt used for de-icing on roads, on parking lots, on sidewalks. And so the general expectation is with more development will come more roads and more parking lots, and we'll need additional salt for de-icing. Very simplified, but that's sort of generally how things are expected to go. In this case, low compact is likely to see the lowest impact at like a 2% increase. And that's because this kind of development will result in the least new roads. It's going to be more infill development on existing roads. And then high dispersed is likely to see a lot more roads out in, more roads being created for the larger amount of land area to be developed. So just again, I don't need to go into the individual maps on the right very much detail, but in general, we're seeing very little change in the urban core because that area has already mostly had its infrastructure of roads and sidewalks developed. But there are certain parts of the metro that are showing up the same on every plot, but there are others like Western Carver or Southern Dakota County that will show large increase. Actually, they're the ones that are likely to show large increases in chloride regardless of scenario, but areas like Northern Anoka and Stillwater will likely see very little change under the low compact scenario and a larger change under high dispersed. But in these areas where urbanization is happening, pollution is likely to get worse.
And the challenge with this is it doesn't account for differences in how cities manage their snow.
No.
Because like Lakeville has seen a huge decrease in how much salt they use because they've gotten better at plowing and how they apply and Minneapolis, I don't think is going to be changing the way they plow, unfortunately, but there's a lot of low-hanging fruit available there.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That's a really good point, and we'll talk about best management practices a little bit, but agreed. This is assuming nothing changes from 2020 to 2050.
I got a quick question. Is there a difference between the salt that's spread and there seems to be a chemical sometimes spread? Is the chemical less chloride in it or anything?
Is it?
It sticks better.
It's a
You don't
different
need-
chloride, not less.
You need less of it because it sticks to the road instead of bouncing into the grass or going down the drain. It tends to stick to the road better.
Less of it runs off. You know, there are a few chloride de-icer alternatives, like they've been looking at acetate or beet juice. None of those have taken off very much. Pretty much the main successful de-icer is chloride-based. So to wrap things up, a lot of the goal of the previous slides was to show there's not a cut and dried best scenario for surface water. Certain kinds of development are going to minimize nitrate runoff, but those same developments may increase chloride runoff. We did see that the low compact scenario was generally the most stable situation where had smaller decreases in nitrate and smaller increases in chloride. And then high disperse was the most volatile with the largest potential decreases in nitrate and the largest increases in chloride. But again, one was not sort of uniformly better. But then in addition, I really wanted to show you guys that surface water impacts are felt at very local scales. In the nitrate example, some watersheds in the more rural parts of the metro are likely to see fairly large reductions in nitrate. But in these same scenarios, nitrate runoff is likely to increase in urban areas as they densify. So we can draw broad conclusions at the metro scale, but that doesn't tell the whole story, and it really ignores how this is going to change where you are in the metro. And then I wanted to reiterate what Jen said in the introduction. In the future, we're largely likely to see big changes in precipitation, which is one of the major drivers of surface water runoff. And so more precipitation and intense storms are likely to impact the region's water in more intense ways than any of these scenarios will. So I want you to keep that in mind.
May I have a question?
Yeah.
So more extreme events can have more runoff in a shorter period of time, but if we're in a drought, overall, the total amount of water runoff is lower. Does one have more impact than another on planning and policies and things like that? Are we better off because we're in a drought, in other words, because there's just less water running off? So none of these things are in high quantities.
I think, Madam Chair, I think, again, I just say it's complicated. I think when you're in drought, you can have more definitely volatile or aerosolized pollutants as well. So, in general, I think we find the more intense rains really cause more bringing pollutants into solution more than the overall volume. I think it's the more intensity that's a big driver.
Madam Chair, can I just add one more thing?
Yes.
Just to go back to what I was saying at the beginning, like if you think about this just from this silo, yeah, droughts are awesome. But I also like to drink water, so we need to think about the water supply as well. And so thinking about water integratedly, that's where the answer does rightfully so. I mean, it's complicated.
So my last point, I just wanted to leave a few things for you connecting to land use. Our scenario planning showed that much of the development it's likely to happen in the next 30 years is at least modeled to be single-family residential. So I think it's important not to sort of let the policies and practices around single-family residential sort of go to the background. Sometimes we focus on commercial or industrial, they're much more intense. But when we talk about single family, I'm talking single urban infill lots, lakeshore lots, new development. We need to find ways to make sure all of them are minimizing water impacts, and there's lots of practices that can do that. You guys know that more than me, cluster development, maximum amount of impervious surface for individual lots, minimizing ordinance exemptions for small infill developments, just keeping all of that in mind, because those are what is driving a lot of water quality changes. And then connected to that, this is sort of tying into what Chair Wolf said, regardless of how much pollution is running off the landscape, whether it's increasing or decreasing in the next 30 years, we have a lot of tools to mitigate pollution in all those situations. We have, water best management practices are really well developed. They're include a huge swath of ideas, from smart development design to green infrastructure like rain gardens, underground treatment to smart salting practices. We're going to need these practices more than ever in the future, and they need to continue to develop and mature with these pollution changes we're seeing, but especially under climate change. So just want to leave those for you to keep in mind, and then I'll pass this off to Lanya.
Thank you. And I do want to recognize the time and leave time for wastewater, so I'll go quickly or I'll skip something. Whatever you guys want to focus on. All right. So I'm Lanya Ross. I've been doing water supply work at the council for 17 years now. So I'm going to talk some highlights of some of the water supply related analyses we did looking at the scenarios data. And I am particularly focusing on two pieces: contamination, which is closely tied to different land use types because they're associated with different potential contaminants. And I'm also very interested in what changing population growth means for future water demand. So those were the analyses that I did. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the contamination results, highlights, and then water demand. But to ground this thinking and our understanding about the vulnerability of our drinking water supplies, I do want to share a map of the parts of the metropolitan area that have been designated by communities and with the Department of Health as drinking water supply management areas. These are the groundwater DWSMAs. We also have areas that have been designated for protection for the surface water supplies. They're not shown here. What I'd like to call your attention to are the areas I've circled. There's a dark green blobs, and those are places that are very highly vulnerable to potential contamination. Two cities that have those areas in them are Brooklyn Park and Burnsville. And so the water flowing beneath the ground in those spots is supplying over 140,000 people, just to give you a sense of the impact of this. So I'm going to show you some results, and I just want to keep those two little areas in mind as you think about this. As Emily talked about, overall, all of these growth scenarios are projecting a big change in single-family residential land use. However, in the parts of the metro that have been designated as very highly vulnerable to contamination, the largest land use change, given our sort of current zoning and our assumptions of what might happen in the future, the biggest change is an increase in industrial use in those very highly vulnerable areas. In all scenarios, industrial development in those areas increases. More industrial development is occurring under our high growth scenarios. If the region grows more than we're expecting it to, expect to see more industrial development in highly vulnerable areas given our current planning and zoning. It's not a lot of growth, but thinking about, is the benefit that we see as a region from that industrial development worth more than the increased risk to 140,000 people? And so those are just the trade-offs as we think about land use planning choices. It's important to keep in mind. And to me, this really jumped out at me as something that these scenarios helped us to see. I think the obvious water supply question that comes to mind is, when we think about the future and growth, what does that mean for water demand? So that's another piece I'd like to call your attention to. Different growth patterns impact water demand differently. So for the analysis that I did, it was very simple. Using assumptions of water use per person based on historical water use. So if we continue to use in the future the same amount of water that we've used in the past, what will our regional water demand be? I just took gallons per person per day for each of the different communities in the metro, multiplied it times the population in a future year, to get gallons of water per community, summed it all up for the region. And this is based on information. It's the same method that we used in the 2015 Metro Area Water Supply Plan, so if you're interested in that method. It's what we've done in the past. What does that mean for our future water demand? There's two pieces of information here I just wanted to call your attention to. On the left, there's 4 bars. That's what the 2015 Metro Area Water Supply Plan projected water demand to be in the future. We reached out to our water supply stakeholders, many conversations about what they were projecting for water supply, and came up with an estimate for 2020, 2030, 2040, and even 2050 water demand. So you're seeing it's about between 350 and 450 million gallons a day. One of the interesting things that they stressed to us was, it is not, we can guess at water demand, but it is not precise. There is a big range in what the future might look like. So those dashed lines are what our water supply stakeholders told us that we should keep in mind as the uncertainty associated with our projections. So plus or minus 20%. It might be a drought year, it might be a wet year, there might be a new industry moving in. There's all these factors that play into our uncertainty with water demand. So that's what we thought water demand would be when we did planning a decade ago. These growth scenarios also allowed us to estimate water demand, and that's the single bar on the right. So I just took the average of all 4 of those growth scenarios. If we have high growth and it's compact, it's high growth and it's dispersed, low growth, compact and dispersed. So that blue bar is kind of the average of all of those. So a little bit more water demand than we were projecting 10 years ago. The black bar shows the highest water demand, and it kind of goes down to like what the lowest water demand in those growth scenarios are. And you'll notice that that is solidly within the range of water demand that we were projecting last time around. So to me, that is one, this call we got from our water supply stakeholders to be thinking about different scenarios and the range of uncertainty, like paid off. They were right. So continuing to use that as a method to look at water demand going forward, I think is a really valuable and useful exercise. 2, this also stresses to me a point Emily was making, and that is that our thinking about growth and the possible range of growth in the future is one important driver for water demand, but it is not the only one. We also have to think about the effects that climate change or significant changes in the economy might be having on our water demand estimates, and so keeping those in mind as we go through policy development and technical analyses. So that was one way of looking at some of these results. Another more interesting sort of facet of the water demand results is this slide, and there's a lot here, so read it when I'm done. But one of the things that we know is it's not just how much water, it's where is that demand happening and what's the source for water in those different areas, because some of our communities rely on surface water, the Mississippi River, Minneapolis, St. Paul, the communities they supply, and some of our communities rely on groundwater. So depending on where that growth happens, we're going to be putting additional pressure onto some different sources. So I have the 2 dispersed growth, high and low growth scenarios on the left here, and I have the 2 compact growth scenarios on the right. And what jumped out at me is that when we are looking at dispersed growth, you see us putting relatively more pressure on our groundwater systems, bumping us up closer to what we've estimated as the sustainable limits of our groundwater sources. And that's an estimate that's in the 2015 Metro Area Water Supply Plan. Compared to in our compact development, we're putting a little bit more pressure on our surface water sources, the existing water supply infrastructure in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and their communities. And so there's some differences in these growth scenarios showing up that way. In all of them, of course, the high growth scenarios are putting more pressure on our existing water supply systems, surface water or groundwater. So we're going to see more investments in expanding well fields, adding distribution pipe, increased treatment costs, I think there was a point earlier too, if we are expanding our systems, that's cost for that and the cost to maintain that ongoing way. So what I took away from this exercise was that in all scenarios, industrial development is increasing in those very highly vulnerable drinking water supply management areas. Growth patterns overall are impacting our future water demand. In all scenarios, regional water demand is increasing, but we also have to consider how other factors such as climate or the economy are affecting uncertainty with our estimates. And think about how these dispersed scenarios, if growth ends up moving out across the region, we may see our region relying more on groundwater than on surface water compared to more compact development, and think about what that means for our infrastructure across the region and long-term costs and opportunities. I think that I am just kind of paraphrasing this again, so I'm gonna
Hand it off.
hand it off, and you can read that while we pass the baton.
Thank you.
Thank you all. My name is Esmaeili. I'm an engineer in the wastewater planning and community programs.
Can you put the mic by your face? You're very quiet.
Yes, sorry. I work in the wastewater planning and community programs group under Colvin today. So I'll present the wastewater findings from the scenario modeling effort. I did want to note that we haven't fully...
Even closer or yell in the mic because Gary can't
Is that
hear
a little
you.
bit better?
Yeah.
So I did want to note that we're not fully completed with the wastewater modeling, so today I'll be discussing some of the trends and the takeaways that we're seeing thus far. And I'll try to go through this quickly in the interest of time. To provide some context, we broke it down the key wastewater concepts into 3 different categories. So regional service area. So growth within the regional service area is planned to be served by the regional wastewater system. And then outside of the regional service area, it's soon to be served by our ISTSs, which are individual sewage treatment systems. So this could be like septic or community treatment systems, as well as local rural center wastewater treatment plants. And then the amount of growth served in the regional service area changes by scenario. So looking at our regional system capacity utilized is impacted not only by the amount of growth, but where that growth is occurring. And then our capital investments are tailored to our regional system capacity needs. And then the third category we're looking at today is other facilities. So these are regional facilities. It could be something like liquid waste receiving or back-to waste, solids processing. So the demand for the location and the composition of those regional services will change depending on the scenario. Okay, and one thing to mention in this presentation that we'll focus a little bit on the high compact and the high dispersed growth scenarios. And the reason for that is that those 2 scenarios are where we see the greatest impacts on our system, specifically that high dispersed scenario. So on the right of the slide, you'll see a graph of the % increase in population to 2050. So our business as usual case is on the far left, and then followed by high compact and high dispersed. And I want to call out specifically that high dispersed scenario. So you'll see an increase in the non-sewer, which is that light blue bar, and the rural center sewer, the orange bar. And then the high dispersed scenario is where we see increases in growth in areas served by those individual sewage treatment systems and the rural local wastewater treatment plants. So this increased growth could potentially lead to environmental degradation and necessitate an extension of regional service. And then the growth pressure on some of those local wastewater treatment plants and changes in permit limits could also necessitate or kind of influence the timing of an extension or an acquisition.
And those plants don't treat to the same level that the Met Council plants treat to. They have different rules that aren't as strict.
Okay, so that's one of the things that we're thinking about in this specific scenario.
Okay.
And then the other thing I want to mention here in that pie chart that's in the lower left corner. So currently we budget about 60% to preservation. So that includes things like maintenance and rehabilitation, and 19% to expansion. And expansion is increases to meet our growth needs. So in this high dispersed scenario, we may see a shift in how much we budget to expansion compared to preservation. Okay. And I won't spend too much time on this slide. It's a little detailed, but we wanted to include this just to give context to what our wastewater system model looks like. So I'll go on to the next slide where we can see kind of a diagram or a simplification of the results and some of the trends that we're seeing. So generally, compact growth looks like the figure on the left, so it resembles somewhat of a bullseye. And then dispersed growth looks a little bit like the figure on the right, so more of a donut shaped. So you'll notice the treatment plant in the center with interceptors branching out from there, the larger interceptor pipes closer in towards the wastewater treatment plant, and then getting smaller as we get further out into the system. So again, this is kind of an oversimplification, but visually it helps demonstrate a few key points, and it resembles our Metro wastewater treatment plant fairly well. So if we look at the high compact scenario there on the left, the majority of growth is occurring in the center and then gradually thinning out. And that increased flow typically goes to our largest interceptors that are located closest to our treatment plant, where they're most capable of handling that capacity. So historically, some of those pipes are oversized and are our oldest parts of our system. So this is more of an efficient use of our built capacity by having that growth occur in areas where we're able to handle those increased flows. On the contrary, if we look at the high dispersed scenario on the right, growth
I think everybody kind of has that idea. We can work on to the next slide.
Sure. Okay, so our third category that we're looking at was our other facilities. So specifically, we're going to focus again in on that high dispersed scenario. So the services that we're thinking about here are things like liquid waste and factor waste receiving, as well as solids processing. In that high dispersed scenario, that increased growth is focused more on the outlying parts of our system, with substantial growth in areas that are served by individual sewage treatment systems and local wastewater treatment plants. So this could increase demand for those regional facilities further out in our system and put pressure on some of our smaller regional wastewater treatment plants. So to kind of give an example of this, the top two photos there are liquid waste receiving. So we have liquid waste receiving tank and facility. Liquid waste tanks haul septic tank and holding tank waste. And in our high dispersed scenario, we see more growth served by ISTSs, which could increase that demand. So while we have liquid waste receiving facilities throughout our region, at many of our larger and mid-sized treatment plants, the size of the plant and the waste characteristics, the good waste is highly concentrated, may make it challenging to handle this type of waste at some of our smaller plants or larger quantities at our medium-sized plants. So the next two slides will just kind of quickly recap and summarize the results and then our connections to land use policy. So again, this is kind of broken up into three different categories. So within our regional service area, that high dispersed scenario focuses growth in the outlying parts of our system. And then outside of our regional service area, it increases ISTS growth and puts pressure on local rural wastewater treatment plants. So under this scenario could necessitate infrastructure expansion or influence the timing of infrastructure acquisition. And then looking at regional system capacity, that high compact scenario puts pressure on the regional infrastructure in our core areas, which are most able to handle that increased flow. Whereas in our high dispersed scenario, it puts pressure on our outer lying infrastructure in the outer lying parts of our system. And then looking at our other facilities, that high dispersed scenario could increase the demand for more regional facilities and services further out in the region, and then some of our smaller treatment plants. And that could increase our need for capital investments to be able to accommodate them. So looking at connections to land use policy, we thought about this in terms of within our regional service area and outside of our service area. So looking within our regional service area, compact development uses our existing wastewater infrastructure more efficiently. And that high dispersed scenario puts pressure on the outlying infrastructure and the outlying parts of our regional service. So that could influence our infrastructure timing and our acquisition. And then looking outside of our regional service area puts pressure, and we see that in terms of significant growth in ISTSs, along with rural wastewater treatment plant pressures, induced growth and incentivizing large lots. I'll pause here, I went through that very quickly, so.
No, I think you covered it.
Great, I'm gonna wrap up really quick because I know we're really at time at the moment. That was a lot of information. We are here to answer your questions. You can get a hold of us and we can answer questions after this meeting if we need to as well. But we really wanted to share today the scenario work that we're doing and how we're thinking about land use planning as we're thinking about our planning areas of water supply, wastewater, and surface water. Really key messages from today are that water is foundational to land use. We need to balance our regional growth while limiting the impacts to our regional waters. And the council land use and water policies are our best tool to connect water and land use planning for the region. Where we're at, we started working on our policy plan about a year and a half, 2 years ago, identified issues we needed to look into. We've worked on some research papers on various topics that we've been working on over the last year and a half. We're in the process of getting all of those up on our website to get information from our partners. So then really later this year, the rest of this year, we're going to be working on drafting the policy for the Water Resources Policy Plan, taking that through our Environment Committee, having engagements with our partners, meetings like this, other public meetings we'll be having, and really having that draft plan available July of next year so that we can adopt the final plan with the rest of the regional development guide by the end of next year. I think I caught us up.
Good job. Do you have any questions?
Nice job, everyone.
Yes.
Jerry?
Is there any way to calculate how much water that we're standing on right now? Underground water?
Oh, is there? Oh, well, go ahead. You can take a stab at it, Lanya.
Well, it's hard because it's not a bucket, it's more of a hose, and so it's constantly moving through the system. And so it's kind of, we can snapshots in time and compare them.
We do have sort of an atlas of what is underneath us so that we have a pretty good estimate of what's going on.
That is a truth. Yeah, we are working on a project right now. My colleagues, John Clark and Henry McCarthy, are working on a water supply planning atlas, and it does have a lot of great information, including some information about how much water there is, where the aquifers are, and when that is released for a draft, I think this would be a great group to share that with.
And it's definitely easier to track over time for surface water. We can track what's flowing through, but asphalt always is changing as well. It's really hard. We have a lot of information about what's in our aquifers underneath us, but you know, it's, as Lane said, it's always moving too and changing.
Well, my understanding is the aquifers are regenerated or filled by water that goes into swamps. That is, swamps, difference between swamps and a lake. Swamps are nature's way of letting the water go down to the aquifers. It filters the water. Is that true?
Madam Chair. So groundwater is replenished multiple ways, of which is precipitation going directly through the surface, you know, infiltrating into the ground. Some goes through wetlands, some goes through swamps. There's even some infiltration through lakes as well. So it's a variety of ways. Each aquifer has a different amount of time it takes to recharge or fill up, so or you know, get the water down into it. Like it takes thousands of years to go to the outside in Hinkley Aquifer, which is now an aquifer that is protected and is not really allowed to be used unless it's a last case resort. Then it can take hundreds of years. Prairie du Chien Jordan Aquifer,
40 or 50.
yeah, 40 or 50, and this then the more superficial aquifers, it takes 30, 40 days at a time. This is all over the board, but so that's why it's very complicated, because it takes more time to go down to different aquifers. There's not the same aquifers across the whole region for water supply.
We are water rich, which makes it hard to count all our money. No.
Yes, I think that's an advantage for Minnesota, unlike other parts of the country.
We are at 6 o'clock, and I try to always get you guys out at 6 o'clock, so thank you, everybody. Feel free to contact any of the presenters today if you have extra questions, and we will be seeing them again. And so with no further business, meeting is adjourned.